Welcome back, everyone. My name is Tweety Lee, APAC Marketing Manager from Dynata. Dynata is one of the world's largest first-party data and insight platforms. The company has built innovative services and solutions around its robust first-party data offering to bring the voice of the customers to the entire marketing continuum. We are very pleased to co-host this webinar with Market Research Society Singapore. The goal of this webinar is to help businesses to adapt and build resilience in the changing world so you can navigate and manage branding effectively during these times. Now I will hand over to Dinesh, Marketing Lead from MRSS, to give us a brief introduction on the organization and today's webinar. Dinesh, over to you.
Hello, everyone. This is Dinesh, Marketing Lead for MRSS. Along with me, we have Manisha Dixit, who's our event lead. So today's session is on the topic of how COVID-19 will shape future of brands. And we talked a bit more about this yesterday, but just going to repeat some of the logistics that it'll run for 50 minutes. After the speaker section, we'll have Manisha, who's going to take questions towards the end. If you have some questions along the way, you can always chat it in the chat box in the control panel, and we'll try to take them as many as possible, or otherwise we'll get back to you separately after the webinar. In case you face any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat session as well. Now, our speakers for today are Craig Griffin from Fuel Research and Consulting and Neil Gaines from Tapestry Works. I'll directly hand it over to them to take us through this brilliant session. Over to you, Neil.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Craig and I would like to share with you some work we've been doing on the impact of COVID-19 and especially how it's going to impact brands moving forward into the future. Of course, COVID's had a huge impact all around the world. Sometimes it's difficult to appreciate just how large that impact is, I think, and without trivializing it, for some of us, it's probably been an inconvenience, albeit a fairly big inconvenience. But for others, it's been life-shattering. And so what we want to do is take a look beyond the sort of more immediate and visible signs that we can see of its impact, and think about the longer term changes that we're likely to see, and especially what these mean for brands and businesses. And we're going to focus on 7 themes, and they fall into 3 areas. So firstly, sort of the fundamentals of branding. And then we want to talk about some emerging need states. And finally, the way that customer experience is changing. And I need to acknowledge that this is not just our own work, but is sort of built on the shoulders of giants, as they say. And a global desk research study that was conducted across 17 different countries, led by some very good friends and colleagues in Milan in Italy, called Beyond Research, who of course were among the first people who experienced the lockdown, apart from our friends in China. And this is a huge piece of desk research. As I say, it looked across 17 countries, and among those countries were China, Singapore, and Thailand. So in today's presentation, we'll focus on Asia and those key 3 countries, along with some additional examples from elsewhere around Asia. And let's kick off by thinking about the fundamentals of branding. And we'll start by looking at corporate responsibility and brand purpose. Warren Buffett once wisely, as he often does, said, only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. And I think COVID has really lifted the veil over many businesses and what their kind of real underlying values were. Sometimes that's been in a very good way. Many brands have really kind of stepped up to the mark in their response. In other cases, it's essentially shown that they were pretty much naked all the time. And as humans, we have this inbuilt ability to trust other people's. It's really important to our relationships. And we all instinctively dislike when we perceive someone as being unfair. To the extent that we often act against our own interests when we see that unfairness happening. And so many companies have really kind of come a cropper, should we say, during the pandemic. In Thailand, and I think in some other Asian markets, the food delivery companies came in for a little bit of a backlash on social media relatively early, because they were perceived to be price gouging and taking advantage of both the restaurants they were serving and the delivery drivers who were helping to connect those restaurants to customers. They had to react pretty quickly against that. And I know that speaking to some of my friends here in Bangkok, many people reacted to that by just simply calling restaurants directly and cutting out the middleman. And this shows that ethics do matter and integrity matters. And the Edelman Trust Barometer from earlier this year really highlights this. In the work that they've done, they see that ethical drivers are 3 times more important to the way that people evaluate trust than sort of the basic competence of getting the job done. In another study they did, once sort of lockdown was in place in several countries, they found that 1 in 3 of the people that they spoke to had recommended to a friend to stop using a company because of inappropriate behavior during COVID. And that figure rose to more than 2 in 3, as I remember, in China. So this is a really should be a big red flag for brands. Now, on the more positive side, some companies have really supported sort of both staff and stakeholders as well as their customers through what's been a very challenging time. One example in Singapore was AIA, who fairly early on in the sort of the spread of the pandemic gave free COVID coverage to all of their customers and also to all of their employees in Singapore. A great kind of preemptive move. Ctrip are a huge travel company in China, some of you will be aware of, and they really took a huge financial hit during the pandemic, but they continued to provide refunds and support their customers, their staff, and their stakeholders. And they launched a plan called the Tong Pao Plan, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. It means the Comrade Soldier plan, and what it involved was them investing more than 1 billion renminbi to provide loans and security for many of their small and medium business partners so they could continue to survive and ultimately thrive when China came out of lockdown. And I think these are really important things for brands to consider. It's an enduring lesson that brands really need to understand their core values and act on them, but act on them in ways that are consistent through time. Now's also, I think, the time as we emerge from the sort of immediate impact to reflect on those values and see if you need to adapt them to the world as it's changing now and make them as relevant as possible. And the Edelman and many other studies that I've seen have shown that transparency and authenticity are becoming more and more important, especially actually for younger consumers. And I would add to that people, when in challenging times, people really appreciate very practical help and solutions to those challenges that they have. And with that, let me hand over to Craig to talk about our next topic.
Thanks very much, Neil. So our second theme is about sustainability. Now, of course, sustainability has been a hot topic now for a number of years and a key focus for businesses. But we believe actually the pandemic will both re-energize the movement, but also redefine it to take on new meanings. But before I get into that, I'd like to share with you a heartwarming story set in Thailand, which broke 2 or 3 months ago, and it was during lockdown in Thailand. And we saw these rare lockerhead turtles return to Thai beaches to lay their eggs in record numbers. And that just really taught us all a lesson that actually when we as humans stop our usual activities, we allow other species to coexist with us. And this is increasingly becoming an issue. We've been told now that the pandemic happened because of our increasing encroachment onto the habitat of the wildlife. And as we continue to do this, we can expect more pandemics in future. So this really should be a huge wake-up call for us and re-energize the environmental movement. But sadly, despite becoming increasingly aware of that link between ourselves and the environment and the pandemic, we're seeing at the same time a huge increase in plastic waste. And that's quite simply because our own concerns for our own safety of ourselves and our family and friends trumps our environmental concerns at this point in time. So we're using more plastic to protect ourselves. So if we think of like home delivery with food, often comes with single serve plastics, often wrapped in lots of plastic, but also the personal protective equipment that we're wearing. Our masks often are disposable, and we're seeing now lots of these are washing up on shores around Asia. And this is a common issue throughout our work, that we're seeing these tensions between different things, and often this is where there's huge insight and huge opportunity. Now, one thing the pandemic has done, of course, is restricted the free flow of goods and of people, and this impacts different countries in different ways. So, for example, in Singapore, which of course 90% of food is imported, so Singapore is in quite a vulnerable position when supply chains are disrupted, and this was highlighted recently. And I understand that the government there is now looking to increase the amount of food produced in Singapore through urban farm initiatives. Myanmar decided it wanted to protect its domestic manufacturers during the pandemic by putting some protection laws in place for imports. And here in Thailand, where I'm based, we saw the huge impact that the pandemic has to the economy. And this was because of largely because of tourism, which is 15% of GDP in Thailand. So of course, when the borders were closed, no tourists coming in, then there were millions of businesses in places like Phuket and Samui, which were affected, which had nobody buying their goods. And this really showed in Thailand's case, how vulnerable it was to the pandemic. So the key theme between all these examples is vulnerability, and governments around the world and in Asia are looking at how to redesign their economies and their societies to be more resilient and self-reliant. I think that's the key word here. So that's what we mean by redefining sustainability. So why does this matter for brands? Well, I've just described the strong interdependency that we've seen between foreign trade and supply chain, and the move towards greater economic self-reliance in countries. But also the economic fallout from the pandemic is leading to a huge amount of vulnerable people, many millions of people now falling under the poverty line. And brands have been, many brands have been active in helping people, and this will increasingly be expected and sought after. Brands that have a net positive impact to society, we think will do well. And this all lends itself towards more longer term business models based on these redefined ideas around sustainability. Our third theme is called Simple Pleasures. And this reflects how during lockdown, with many of our usual entertainment choices not available, we've sought to look for simple pleasures in the home. Now, often during our lives, personally, we may face a crisis which makes us look inside, become really introspective. But this seems to be happening on a collective basis now. So our society could be described as having a dark night of the soul, where values in society are getting reset. We're focusing on what's truly important in life and looking at how we can find happiness and joy in the middle of a pandemic. And for many of us, this means the home becomes the focal point of our lives. And here's some example of some of the simple pleasures that we've turned to. Many of us have turned to cooking and baking with our families, the simple enjoyment of those day-to-day activities. Maybe we've dusted off the board games that we haven't played for years. A lot of us have been tending to our gardens, although in Asia that tends to be on our balconies. All these ways that we've found some joy from some simple pleasures. One thing that's been really interesting is the language that's used during the pandemic. So we've heard the language of essential and non-essential, and typically it's applied to work and workers. Now, clearly there are very obvious heroes during a pandemic, the people that are saving our lives, particularly the doctors and the nurses. But I think we've also become more aware of the everyday heroes, the people in our community that help us to lead normal lives when we're faced with a disruption to global supply chain. So I'm talking about the Grab drivers that are delivering our food, the retail assistants, all those small businesses in our local community that help, that are fighting to survive and help us to maintain some semblance of normality. So why is this important to brands? Well, brands often talk to our aspirations. Now, in the middle of a pandemic, a lot of our aspirations are taking a back seat, and we focus very much on finding enjoyment in the now. And our brands need to reflect these changing moods and mindsets. At the same time, though, we still need to feel a sense of progress in our lives. That's an innately human need that we have. So brands can look to see how they can help us to feel this sense of progress. But of course, with uncertain futures, we are increasingly finding joy in the moment. In the moment is important. So, what can your brand do to bring fun and joy? Our fourth theme is about health, and of course, health in the middle of a pandemic has been an intense focus for us all. And indeed, we think that every brand in one way or another is now a healthcare brand, in the sense that every brand can be doing something to help us with our health and well-being. The first responsibility a brand has is as a first line of defense against the virus. So I think we've all had these experiences of going shopping in these COVID times, eating at restaurants, and seeing these extreme measures that businesses to help us keep safe, to protect us from the virus. That includes more forms of contactless payment available to us as well, to minimize the interaction between humans. This picture on the right is interesting. Just a few days ago in Korea, there was a news story about how the bus shelters have been incorporating the temperature checks to help us to check that whether our temperature, whether we have a fever or not, so we can see, obviously that's an indicator of the virus, but also incorporate some UV rays in the bus shelters to actually kill the virus. So there are numerous ways that the businesses and brands are working to help to ensure our health and safety and to protect us from the virus. Now, we're all very focused on hygiene at the moment. And if you're a brand that's in certain categories, so personal care and household care are the obvious categories where hygiene is important, it's probably a good time now to be looking at changing meanings of hygiene, because certainly the pandemic is changing the expressions of hygiene. And actually we've done some research in this area for a specific client, and this is helping them to understand possible innovation opportunities moving forward, but also just to look at their communication, to check that whether it be in their packaging or their advertising, the communication is in line with these emerging meanings of hygiene. Another thing that brands can be doing is helping us with the last line of defense, and that's our underlying health and the functioning of our immune systems. And this is really important because we know that sadly those people that are dying from COVID, more than 95% have some underlying health condition, heart disease or diabetes, something like this. So there's an opportunity now for brands to help us lift our underlying health. And of course, as humans, we want to feel some sense of control to our destiny, not that we're just at the mercy of a virus. So there's a real opportunity for brands operating in certain areas such as gut health or immunity or heart health. All of those can help us feel more secure about our future. And one area that's perhaps less talked about is what we call the silent pandemic. And Stephen Taylor, in his book, The Psychology of Pandemics, basically said that during a pandemic, this aspect is somewhat ignored and may actually have the greatest impact. So the emotional and mental strain of living during a pandemic, and not just the lockdown, but the economic fallout afterwards, the impact it has on our concerns about our futures, our jobs, our businesses. And again, this is an area that, you know, there's a lot of research that supports that even before the pandemic in Asia, we're becoming more stressed out. There's more mental health problems, and people are increasingly looking for solutions. So here's a news story from Singapore about a lady that during lockdown bought more than 50 plants to help her cope with stress. So again, brands can look to address need states that people have around addressing their anxiety needs or enhancing their mood, increasing their focus, helping them with sleep. Those are some obvious examples of things that people will be suffering with during this time in which brands can help. So why does this matter for brands? Well, as we said in the beginning, all brands, we believe now, in one way or another, are healthcare brands and can be doing something to help. There's many opportunities for brands to innovate, to address emerging physical and mental health needs. And of course, we see new emerging meanings now in health and hygiene, which might call for a review for some brands, communications in certain categories, and also lead to opportunities for innovation. So I'm now going to hand back to Neil, who's going to talk through the next thing.
Thanks, Craig. our next topic is really how COVID has made us think more locally. So although it's obviously a global pandemic and it's pretty much affected every country around the world, disrupted supply chains and trade, it's stopped people traveling. Really, the most effective solutions we've seen are all very local, even down at the sort of community level. And I think we've seen around Asia, the local communities have really rallied around to help each other. In Thailand, a project called the Pantry of Sharing was launched in Bangkok, has now spread all around Thailand. And very simple principle, people who could afford it would buy basic foodstuffs, non-perishable foods, basic hygiene, and put them in a pantry. And then those who were struggling were encouraged to come and take what they needed. A great kind of community-based solution to help people get through. And brands have also been playing their part, and I think really strengthening their ties with local communities. And I've got 3 examples here on the right. Sederhana and actually several other restaurant chains in Indonesia, they realized the importance of the essential workers. So even while they were adapting their business models to one that was focused on delivery, they made sure that the people doing the deliveries were getting fed and were okay. In Thailand, Tops is one of the biggest supermarket chains, and they've been working on an initiative to help Thai farmers to sell their summer fruit and to sell it at a price that's guaranteed and helps sustain their businesses wherever they are in Thailand. And then finally, a kind of a great little story about those pets that get forgotten. So when Wuhan locked down in China fairly early on, it happened pretty abruptly, and many pet owners were separated from their pets. So Royal Canin stepped in and made sure, and by giving away free pet food, made sure that they're all fed and kept happy until they could be reunited with their owners. And that's part of, to go back to our theme of brand purpose, that's part of an ongoing initiative that they have to support pet shelters. So these are great examples, and Craig's going to talk more about digitalization in a minute, but we see that the way that technology is empowering e-commerce actually really helps local businesses. So it helps them to reach out to potential customers, but it also helps put customers in touch with exactly the right business for them, with exactly the right product or service, be that in their local neighborhood or even, say, in another part of Thailand. And I think this focus on localization really matters, and it's one of the strongest trends we found actually in the global study. So in France, people were talking about supporting their local farms and their local cheese shops. In Australia, they talked about buying local brands rather than international brands. So I think there's a real opportunity here for local brands to continue to strengthen their local ties and become more integrated with their communities. It's a very different set of issues for global brands we haven't really touched on today, but there is already a trend towards a sort of local brands having a much stronger position in many markets, because those economies of scale and advantages of mass marketing becoming much less important than they used to be. So global brands have already started sort of customizing their offerings and messages to local markets. And I think that's something they're going to have to do more and more. And then I think that for brands that have generated goodwill during the crisis, there's a real opportunity here to build more of a legacy. And that brings us to this customer experience issue of the paradox, as I put it, between personalization and data privacy. And that COVID, again, I mean, this is something that was already happening, but COVID has really thrown a spotlight on this issue because it's just so much more in our faces now than it ever was. Around Asia, most governments, I think, have been putting in place track and trace systems, rightfully, to try and protect us and to control the spread of the virus. But that's raising a lot of concerns. And a recent study conducted by the World Independent Network for Market Research and ISMAR shows that the levels of concern about sharing data are reaching very high levels now all around the world, but Asia being one of the highest, with 75% of people concerned about sharing their data. In the same study, around half of people actually had a personal experience of where they thought their data had been misused. This should be a big concern for brands. And a little story from Hangzhou highlights where the limits might be. So Hangzhou, many of you might have been there. I've been very lucky to have visited a few times. It's a beautiful city, famous for its lakes, and also famous for being the home of Alibaba and some of the Chinese technology companies. And there, the local government decided that the track and trace data gave them a great opportunity to build something more substantial. And they proposed broadening the use of that app to include other kinds of personal health data. So essentially they could link it to people's medical records and lifestyles and give them some kind of index of healthiness and risk. That didn't go down very well with the local population, and there was outrage on social media. And I think the lesson is that people can accept some level of intrusion when it's to address a public health threat, and therefore when there's a very big benefit to them. But you can't take it too far. They don't want more intrusion into their personal lives. So I think the lessons here are clear. Although there's great opportunities with digitalization for personalizing services, there are also huge risks for brands. And again, this is an issue that came out in the Edelman Trust Barometer earlier this year as being one of the biggest issues moving forward. So I think the lesson is for brands to be very clear on how and why they intend to use data to improve specific customer services, and then use that privilege to give customers more control over their own data and use that as a way to build trust rather than destroy it. And with that, let me hand back to Craig.
Thanks, Neil. So our final theme is about accelerating digitalization. And, you know, of course, we've all during the pandemic been forced to do more things online, whether that's buy groceries, whether it's work from home. Sometimes that's even socializing with family and friends that we've not been able to meet personally. But the question remains, is this something that's going to stick, or will we sort of go back to our old ways? Now, of course, in posing that question, we have to remember that there's no, even coming out of lockdown in many countries, there's no immediate return to normal. So, I'm sure we will have all faced these scenes where we go shopping or go to an entertainment complex, and you know, we have to comply with social distancing, we have to wear our masks, we're getting our temperatures taken. It's a very different experience to what it was pre-COVID, and it's, you know, hardly a sort of relaxed, carefree experience. So there's no real immediate return to a pre-COVID world. But I think it's worthwhile not just looking at it from a consumer habits perspective, but also looking at from how how businesses have had to respond. So for some businesses traded through physical premises, they had to adapt quickly just to continue with their business. So we saw things like car showrooms being brought online to have virtual showrooms. We saw virtual viewing of real estate, those kind of initiatives, which were all about continuity. But this investment is not just about continuity during a pandemic. We know that we're going to face very tough economic times ahead, and businesses are looking at how can they use digital channels to be more future-proof, because we don't know what's around the corner. We don't know when we may face another lockdown or another pandemic. So increasingly being future-proof and resilient, but also businesses are looking at their cost structures, given the challenging economic times that surely will lie ahead. So that's also driving investment. Now, of course, for a lot of businesses now, a lot of small businesses, it's very much the case of digital first. And as Neil mentioned before, what's happening with the technology now with channels, we have things like Facebook shops available, which allow retailers to trade without having a physical store. So this is surely set to continue the acceleration. And I think there is now an emerging consensus that we are facing a huge period of digital acceleration. I mean, McKinsey back in May said that in the space of a few weeks during that lockdown, we'd vaulted about 5 years forward. And we believe that's certainly true. That question remains, how much of our behavior can be replaced by online means? And I think shopping is a good area to look at, and particularly the online marketplaces, which have really improved their digital experiences in the last 2 or 3 years. So they've introduced a lot of gamification approaches, such things like flash sales and quizzes and coins. And in the case of Alibaba in China during the lockdown, actually getting the store assistants to do live streaming via Alibaba channels. So there's a lot of innovation within these online marketplaces, and they're trying to replicate the sense of fun, discovery, and adventure that we naturally experience when we go shopping via traditional means. Then the question is, to what additional shopping experience. So certainly where I live in Thailand, there is a variety of different retail formats, from amazing department stores as good as any in the world, to night markets, to traditional floating markets. So lots of different formats there. And then if we really think about the different needs that are being met through these formats, the need to relax, the need to escape, the need to connect with people that are selling the goods, the need to socialize with our family and friends. So there's a variety of different needs that have been met by existing shopping channels. Why does this matter for brands? Well, the accelerating digital adoption is, as more people experience your brand online, is changing the way, changing the control you have over your brand. So this needs to be factored in when managing your brand. And certainly digital experiences are getting better, but as we've seen, they can't really meet the full range of need states that people have, particularly those social need states where we're shopping with family and friends. But of course, it's important to understand that different channels have very different needs. So if you're managing a certain channel, or if you're a traditional retailer, it's important to be really clear on the needs that that specific channel is delivering to, and make sure that you're offering best-in-class experiences in that channel. So those were our 7 themes. I hope there was something thought-provoking there that's given you some ideas. And I really want to just leave you with one final thought, one final message. And now, of course, society and culture is always in flux. But of course, there are times in history when the rate of change is accelerating. And this current pandemic is one of those where there's this huge social change happening. So really, for brand owners, it's important to be on top of these changes, to understand them, so that you can make sure that your brand stays culturally relevant. And the work that we've been doing in this area to understand the change and to help brands through this change, we've launched an initiative called Culture Kitchen. So there's more on our website about the work that we do. But also, if you found these 7 themes interesting, there's more detail in a PDF book, which is available on the themes that can download from our website. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to us via our number or email addresses here, and we'd love to have a conversation with you about our work. So that's all from us. I think now we're going to take some questions.
Right, Neil and Craig, thank you very much. Let's switch on our camera so everybody can see us as well.
Can you see me okay?
Absolutely.
And you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Great. Good to see you, Craig. And yeah, so thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I was really struck by how much there are sort of contradictions that you see in the way things are, right? You've got local and global, you've got privacy and safety, and all of those dilemmas that people are sort of negotiating through. So we've had some questions coming in. Let's dive straight into it. And it's related to this idea of flux that you're talking about. And so because there is so much change, it's really a question about, with so much change for both companies and consumers, how can brands navigate that inability to make plans?
Joe, well, let me say something. I'm sure Craig will have something to add. Yes, it's very challenging, of course. And what I would say is there are some things we're more certain they're going to happen. So we all know that there's going to be more digitalization. So if companies obviously haven't been looking at that, I think that during COVID, they've started that process. But there's also approaches to planning that can help. And one that we've been using around COVID is this sort of idea of scenario planning. And I'm not sure people may have come across that, or at least heard that name. The principle is quite simple. It's not you plan for one distinct future, but rather you think about what are the most likely things that are going to happen in 6 months or 12 months or 5 years. Create 2 or 3 or 4 alternative scenarios for how the future might be, and then think about, okay, if those are going to happen, where would we need to be? So at least you kind of have a plan for how things might turn out in the future. But you have alternative plans because you know that there are different ways that the future might go. Craig, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I think there's 2 things going on here. So I think firstly, individual countries, things are changing very quickly. For example, going in and out of lockdown at very short notice. So there's a lot of quick change that businesses need to manage. I think in the work that we've done with the 7 themes, one thing that struck us is actually how consistent those 7 themes have been for the last 3 or 4 months. So we weren't quite sure when we started out, when we started writing and doing the research, whether we could talk about these themes in 3 or 4 months. But what we're finding is they're still very relevant, but actually our understanding of them gets more nuanced over time, and we start to see the linkages between the different themes. So I think the 7 themes we've identified gives everyone a framework to look at the change that's happening, but then at the same time, there's lots of sort of micro things that are happening that we all need to keep in touch with.
Yeah, it's great to know that there are some themes which are consistent. And so, talking a little bit more about those 7 themes, because this was done across many different countries, right? You have 17 countries. Did you find that there was, so did you find that there were certain themes which were more predominant in Asia versus in the other markets, or has it been quite consistent across? So if you're thinking about Asia and brands targeting Asian markets, would you emphasize on some of those more than the others?
I wouldn't divide it by region quite in that way. To be honest, the themes were pretty consistent around the world. I think I highlighted localization, one that was very strong everywhere. But I think we see all the 7 themes pretty much all around the world, sometimes a little bit more advanced than others. And of course, sometimes that just reflects, like, for example, if we talk about digitalization, which was the last thing we touched on, that very much depends on how well a country is developed in terms of the technology. And China actually is probably more advanced on that than any other country in the world. Where we found bigger differences, funnily enough, was in the responses and the consumer behavior and the way that people reacted, particularly in the initial stages of COVID, where we saw much more kind of negative sentiment and almost aggressive response to it in a lot of Western countries. And we didn't find that at all in the Asian markets. There was a much more kind of, this may be the wrong word, but sort of passive acceptance of what was happening and sort of just getting on with things. Initially, we thought that was because a lot of the Asian countries have already experienced this kind of pandemic and therefore kind of more mentally prepared in a way. But I've been doing some research in Indonesia, which is really interesting because what it's showing is that it's not so much that those negative feelings don't happen in Asia, it's that they get suppressed because of the local cultural values. So people just don't talk about them explicitly, but implicitly they're feeling them. So they're feeling that denial, they're feeling the anger, but they don't talk about it. And that maybe in the long term is an issue in terms of the silent pandemic that Craig talked about.
Yeah, I think there's a real interesting theme in terms of time and the kind of impact it's going to have. Like the nature of the beast is changing, right? So yeah, and it's interesting to see how that would affect responses to it. So related to that, there's a question on, with so many of us experiencing COVID fatigue, would you recommend that brands don't explicitly connect with the COVID context?
Craig, you want to?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think the most important things for brands to focus on is some of the mindsets that that COVID is causing. So yeah, perhaps I think you're right that there is this sort of fatigue and everyone's sick of hearing and reading about COVID, but certainly the way that psychologically we're being impacted, and obviously I shared earlier about the silent pandemic and the kind of mindsets and emotional states that we're in. So I think that the key thing for brands is to resonate with the kind of mindsets that COVID create. Now, I've seen some brands do some very creative work, referencing implicitly the situations that we're finding ourselves in because of COVID. So I mean, my view on that would be, yeah, it can be done more implicitly and subtly. And if you're resonating with someone's current mindset and psychological state, then I think that would be fine.
Yeah.
So hygiene was one of the sort of issues that you talked about.
Yeah.
Do you find that the way people are thinking about hygiene has changed? Or are there new dimensions or things that are getting more accentuated? How is that kind of shifting and changing?
Well, for sure, it is shifting and changing. I mean, it just the most obvious way is become more relevant, and it's something I think people are just more aware of, and we're also more aware of different aspects of hygiene, different particular meanings, just from the fact that, as an example, we use a hand sanitizer multiple times a day, and that hand sanitizers are built around certain meanings of hygiene. So those just become much more top of our minds, and therefore shaping how we're thinking about it, and shaping potentially how brands in other categories maybe should be thinking about communicating hygiene. So yeah, absolutely. It's a cultural codes are always changing anyway, but I think again this is a period of acceleration in those trends. Craig?
Yeah, I think what's interesting for me with this is the sense to which some of these new meanings are going to get kind of coded into system one. And I sort of sense intuitively, just from my own experience, when you're in an environment now, you are kind of psychologically feeling different and responding differently to a pre-COVID world. So I think as our experience with retail and restaurants and public spaces is changing, some of this really is getting coded into system one now, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. But it's going to have huge implications, I think, for brands and for everyone.
Yeah, so look out for new hygiene factors, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think hygiene's even creeping into some categories you'd never expect it, like food, as an example.
Yeah. Right. There's another question about. Right. So we've had some examples in the presentation, you know, about worldwide brands, etc. Do you have any others? Let's see, best-in-class examples of brands responding well in these COVID times?
Let me think. Neil, go ahead if you can. If you've got something on.
Well, I mean, there are the obvious ones that sort of switched their production to making hand sanitizer or making face masks, or fashion brands and alcohol brands. I think there are more interesting examples. One that comes to mind, which was kind of came out in the US, that when we were doing the sort of desk research, was some of the things that Nike were doing, which were quite interesting. They changed their messaging to just do it at home, but they were kind of like they were promoting an app which they developed, gave it away for free, basically told people how to translate their usual exercise routine into something that they could do at home, even in a sort of small living room. And then, of course, more recently, their response to Black Lives Matter and their, I don't know if you've seen their recent ad with a sort of the montage of people from all sorts of backgrounds and so on, which also acknowledges COVID and acknowledges that you can still play sport even when you can't do it in teams, etc., etc. So they've been quite, I think, quite good in the way they've responded, in a way that makes COVID normal, talks about it, but talks about how they can still do the things that they associate with the Nike brand, even in a sort of different world. Some of the alcohol brands have been quite interesting as well. Personally, I love the Guinness ads when they're, you know, they have that iconic, the black drink with the white top, and then there's one image they made where the white top was a white sofa, and it was just like, yeah, you can still enjoy the drink, but in your own home, etc., etc. So there's a couple that come to my mind. Craig, you got any to add to that?
Well, I was just thinking through, as I was thinking through the examples, I think there's two broad categories. One category is those brands that have kind of followed the template of show, not tell. So they're really, I'm just trying to think of examples now which are falling short, but I think there's several companies that have actually really gone out to either help their employees or help their customers. Neil gave one example in his presentation of insurance situation, the C-Trip travel company, where they've really sought to help people. So there's a sort of show not tell philosophy. So the companies that have followed that tend to have got a lot of positive feedback on social media. And then there's just been clever creative work, again, which Neil referenced there. I remember seeing clever creative work from Burger King, which was about how to make your own Whopper at home. Budweiser, I think they resurrected their old What's Up campaign to connect it to this idea that we've been isolated. It's a good time to, you know, to catch up with people. So there's sort of two camps, I think, that you know, of clever work that I've seen, sort of clever creative work,
Yeah.
and then the brands that have really looked at purpose and thought about what are we here for, and not, you know, not try to just be empathetic, but really try to do some good. And those are the two sort of categories that either people are responding to well at this point in time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's a learning process for everybody. Everyone's kind of experiencing this for the first time, and you know, learning as they go. So we are out of time. It's been interesting. We've heard quite a few themes related to time, scenario planning, empathy. So it's been great talking to you guys and listening to your presentation. So thank you so much for that. And also thank you to the audience for participating and being active in this. We will be sending the recordings of the session and also your free ebook after this. So look out for that. And we look forward to seeing everyone again on the next MRSS webinar. Right, so thanks again, guys. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.
Bye.